Kia ora koutou. It's great to be here. I'm a recent Auckland ratepayer, as I was just saying to Phil Goff a minute ago. So I've got a real view about the future of Auckland. I grew up here, so it's important to me personally, as well as, of course, to New Zealand. We have a wonderful panel that we're going to talk through some issues over the next 35 minutes or so. Really, the idea of thinking about our economy, thinking about businesses in this great city as it impacts New Zealand. How can we maximise the edge that we've received? How can we maximise the advantages we've had through the last year of being COVID-free? How can we take advantage of this new world that's emerging, this next normal that's emerging globally around the world as we start to move again, as we start to get back to business, as we start to get back to whatever the next normal looks like? A massive opportunity for us, but of course also some big threats as well. As Peter Gluckman said just a few minutes ago, and I think the whole panel here will agree with him, our COVID halo is slipping. We were the heroes just 6 months ago, but of course as the rest of the world starts to open, other countries, other cities, other peoples are doing all that they can to attract that next dollar of investment, that next skilled migrant, that next business growth opportunity. So how can we join that? How can we play our part in that? I've got an excellent panel that's been put together to talk about that, and I'm going to introduce each of them and get each of them then to give a few minutes of thinking, a few minutes of their statements, and then we're going to have a bit of a question session. And please come straight back to us through Slido with your own thoughts, your own ideas, and see if we can't include those in the conversation. Let me introduce firstly Anna Kominik, who's directly to my left. She's the Asia Pacific Region Director for WISC. Anna leads a multinational team bringing the world's first self-flying, electric, vertical takeoff and landing, air taxi. No more car parks. She's bringing that to market right now. Before joining WISC, she held senior management positions in the public and private sectors, working across Australasia, and served as a consultant to boards, governments, and the aviation sector. She's currently the independent chair of the Electricity Retailers Association. She sits on the board of the New Zealand United States Business Council and the New Zealand International Festival of the Arts. She's a member of the New Zealand Institute of Directors. She was a recipient of the Commonwealth Foundation Emerging Pacific Leaders Scholarship, and so on and so on and so on. She currently serves on the Vertical Flight Society's board of directors as the director of the Asia-Australasia region, a powerhouse of thinking in our country. Anna, the floor is yours. Please tell us what you think.
Tēnā koutou katoa, thank you. It's always a bit difficult when you hear those bios. Listen, I guess as part of the aerospace cluster in New Zealand, and it may be of news to everyone, but we actually have a growing, thriving aerospace cluster in New Zealand, worth about $2 billion at the moment, and it's going to be more like $10 billion by 2030 at the rate that it's growing. It's a huge opportunity for Auckland, it's a huge opportunity for New Zealand. This is green tech predominantly, so I'm talking about both aviation technologies and space. And this is not just Rocket Lab. These are about a cluster of about 20 other medium-sized companies and a lot of smaller startups that are starting to grow up under our wings quite literally. So from an ask perspective out of today, what I'm looking for is Auckland to take the lead. We're seeing, I know we don't like looking across the Tasman, but Australia announced yesterday a $34 billion fund for just our kinds of aircraft. They're coming hunting for the kinds of opportunities that New Zealand already has a competitive advantage in. And we have this opportunity as a result of COVID. It's broken down the distance issue. We've doubled our R&D in New Zealand, and there's such a huge opportunity for electric aviation, green tech aviation technologies to grow in Auckland. Auckland's got the most perfect environment for it. We've got the infrastructure from the space industry, and we've also got the population, the geography, and a really early adopter community who are fantastic at taking on new technologies. Just ask Caroline. And my second ask is that we move away from our obsession with housing as an investment. I want to see us really get into the productive sector. I want a really clear strategy for how we're going to do that. But we've got about 10% growth in investment in startups in New Zealand. Imagine if we got that to $1 billion and it was thousands of startups. That would be high-value jobs. That would be the social and economic benefits that we can absolutely grow for the future, and that will just take us into a post-COVID economy that, I think we can all be proud of, not just from an economic perspective, but most importantly from a social perspective. That's me.
Well, thanks, Anna. Let me now introduce distinguished Professor Peter Hunter. Peter completed his engineering and Masters of Engineering degrees at the University of Auckland before undertaking his PhD work in physiology at the University of Oxford, where he researched, wait for this, finite element modelling of ventricular mechanics. Since then, his major research interests have been around modelling various aspects of the human body using specially developed computational algorithms in an anatomically and biophysically based approach, which incorporates the detailed anatomical and microstructural measurements and material properties into continuum models. And the first time I came into your lab, Peter, and looked on screen at that, I remember it was a number of years ago now, it was amazing and frightening all at the same time to think about that kind of technology and the possibilities of it. It was astonishing to see, I must say. Peter's received numerous accolades for his work. In 2010, he was appointed to the New Zealand Order of Merit. He's been awarded the Rutherford Medal, New Zealand's top science award, as well as the Kia World Class New Zealand Award in Research, Science, Technology and Academia. He's a Fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand and of the Royal Society of the UK, of course, as well. He's one of our top academics and one of our best thinkers that I've ever dealt with, I must say. So, Peter, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Phil. Tēnā koutou katoa. I'd like to just talk about the opportunity for New Zealand and Auckland in relation to medical technologies. I think it's about a $600 billion worldwide global opportunity market. We currently have $2 billion per annum in that market, very much an export market. I think that the universities in New Zealand have produced about 25, 30 companies over the last 6 years. Auckland's produced 25 companies in the medtech space in the last 6 years, and that's attracted about 250 million investment, employs around 300 people. So there's a huge opportunity there. But I think we need to step up our game. I think the opportunity is very much in our favour at the moment, and I think we could easily step up our game. But I think to do that, we need to create an ecosystem in Auckland, acting on behalf of the whole country, not just Auckland, but where we bring together all the, and it's an ecosystem that we're proposing as a medtech innovation quarter in Grafton, where we bring the capabilities of the Bioengineering Institute together with the medical school, the DHBs and business into a ecosystem that can really be a major player on the world scene, attract international investment and offer a lot of high-tech jobs for Kiwis. And I think we do need to have government de-risking early research to get it to the point where the investment can come in. And so we do need, of the order of around 3 million a year at least to maintain the networks, to make sure we've got the pipeline coming from the universities through to that sector. But it's a huge opportunity. I think the recent Productivity Commission report, which was a survey of opportunities for New Zealand, really hit the nail on the head in terms of ecosystem. Once you create that sort of environment with an ecosystem where people can all the relevant players can rub off each other in terms of the business community, the academic community driving the innovation and research, the medical, the DHBs providing procurement and often good ideas for new companies. Bringing all that together into an ecosystem in Grafton, I think, could be one of the opportunities that Auckland has and New Zealand has for a high-tech sector.
Thanks, Peter. It's when Peter talked to me about this the other day, I just thought there was a huge opportunity because, as we've already heard from Peter Gluckman, innovation's not something that necessarily happens just in people's heads. It happens because people get together. It happens in a physical space. And Google, Caroline, you know all about that. So the idea of creating a medtech space, a medtech place, I think it's a hugely big idea, so I commend it. Let me turn to Nigel Broomhall. Nigel's the CEO and co-founder of Invisible Urban. He says, and I agree with him, we can't conserve our way to a solution. People just won't buy it. We have to create sustainable solutions that are commercially sound and demonstrate value. The world ahead of us needs to be more exciting and have more choice than the world we're leaving. He's an electricity geek with more than 18 years of electricity industry experience. He's worked across Oceania, Europe and the US in electricity retailer, generators, lines companies, IBM, and is an electricity expert for Vasa ET. Oh, and he's running a New Zealand-based EV charging business for the last 3 years. He says he loves this stuff and he can talk for hours. Let's get him to talk for 2 minutes. Nigel.
Thanks for that. So, yeah, the two areas that I think that we need to focus on as a city and as a country are all around attracting talent, and I think there's a few speakers that have touched on that. And everything that comes out of my mouth will be focused on technology, because technology is the single largest driver of productivity gains. And there is a war for talent that's happening around the world. We're just a little startup focused on the US market, but we're in what they call a white-hot space. So we're in the electric vehicle charging space, or e-mobility, and we've gone through the whole journey so far. So earlier this year we were doing our seed funding round, and at the same time we managed to get into the finals of the Global Startup Energy Transition Awards in Germany. So this is a global award, 90 countries enter it. There was more than 600 awards, 600 entries, and we got into the finals. And we were the only New Zealand company there. Within 24 hours, 4 cities had reached out to us to pitch for us to come to their city and to trial their technology. One of them was in 60 minutes. And we're still having ongoing discussions with them. There is a very aggressive war for talent happening, because cities have sat down and worked out throughout the world, these are the technologies that we would like to see applied here. E-mobility happens to be one of them. Wastewater is another one. How you deal with green spaces is another one. And then they've put together frameworks and gone out and actively targeted key individuals, key startup businesses, and attracted them to go and work and live and develop their technology in their cities. So we have been at the front line of that in terms of experiencing that sort of approach, and it is very aggressive. And I would liken it to the All Blacks and Talent Scouts. So these aggressive cities, mostly smart cities, you would have heard the names before. So Peter talked this morning about Tel Aviv, that's one. Gothenburg was another that was very aggressive. Chicago, New York, LA, they all have hunters that are out there in the world looking to attract people to their cities. And COVID, which I know is the theme of this event, really wasn't talked about at all. There was an assumption that yes, you'd be safe, yes, we'd do the right protocols, but it was business as usual. And there was an assumption that we would come and work in these cities, so in Europe, in the US, etc. So I think we've got a real opportunity, and it's also a threat that we need to get into that game and we need to compete hard. On the other side, I think there's an opportunity that the Prime Minister talked about this morning that I completely agree with, that I've always had this frame in my head that we are Petri dish New Zealand. So we are an incredibly easy place to do business. Our people love technology. It's easy to move around the country, and we're a non-litigious environment. So if someone breaks a fingernail doing something, they're not going to result in a class action lawsuit and you lose your business. So I think we've got an opportunity to attract those types of businesses here, and the one area that I think we should focus on, because it is a major problem for our city, is autonomous transport. Now, the reason why we need to focus on that is because we all know that if you're involved in anything that involves moving anything around the city, you're going to have a problem. And autonomous will start to address that and meet the needs of our transition to electric vehicles.
Well, thanks, Nigel. Some really interesting opportunities there. The idea of a petri dish, the idea that Auckland can choose some stuff and invest in. The point you were making to me a few days ago was that doesn't actually need to cost a lot. There's ways you can do that doesn't actually cost millions of dollars. Caroline Rainsford, I'm going to bring you in, our country director in New Zealand and Australia right now. Is that right? Yeah, so that's not bad. For Google, and doing that job out of Auckland, in a career that spanned working for the global multinational Philips Royal Electronics. Caroline's had roles based in the Middle East and Africa, and time at Latitude New Zealand, previously, of course, GE Capital. Carolyn says her latest position will allow her to set a long-term vision for how New Zealand businesses can grow and transform in the digital age. So no pressure, Caroline, with that kind of vision. Tell us some of the insights that Google's gained during the pandemic and post, and what you think it means for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, unsurprisingly, I've always believed in the role of digital transformation to support Auckland's economy, but more so now than ever, the impetus that we need to place behind it is so compelling. We've actually just released an economic impact report with the economists at Accenture that shows that there's $46.6 billion of economic value to be gained annually if we really truly embrace digital transformation. But over close to 40% of that comes from emerging technologies. And whilst we're not doing a bad job in Auckland of embracing some of these, there is so much more opportunity. Every day, I guess I get the first-hand experience of seeing businesses in New Zealand over the last year grapple with the impacts of COVID. And I've seen companies embracing, reaching customers digitally online, both here in New Zealand and overseas. I've seen people using AI to really sort out the impacts on supply chain during COVID. But we need to do so much more of it. And I guess for me, and what's common across this panel today, is the importance of digital skills. Because we can have all this technology and we can invest in ICT infrastructure in New Zealand, but if we don't have the digital skills and capability, we can't realise the benefit of it. And I spend a lot of time with small businesses in New Zealand and startups. And during, there's some recent research by CPA, it's an Asia Pacific survey of small businesses. And out of 11 OECD countries surveyed in this, New Zealand ranked third worst in terms of small business growth in the last year. And the single biggest determinant of that is our lack of digital skills and capability. So what I want to see Auckland really leaning into is how can we embrace programs like MB and MindLab's Digital Boost Pledge, but put that on steroids to really make sure that we're investing and supporting digital skills here. I also obviously get to see on a daily basis the exciting world of consumer behaviour changes. You all know that you're more honest with Google than you are with your own mothers, certainly your wives and husbands. And the changes that we have seen in consumer behaviour over the last year are just incredible. Greg touched on the rise of e-commerce. We've had more e-commerce growth in the last year than we've had in the decade prior in New Zealand. Auckland businesses are set up incredibly well to capitalise on this, but there's a lot we need to do to realise that.
Well, let's stay with you, Caroline, because you talked about digital skills, and there's already on the Slido, there's a number of questions about digital skills and the role that Google's had for quite a while around improving some of that. The fact of the matter is we're still not very good at this, and to your point, small businesses in particular aren't, and they also need to go to the world. What could Auckland be doing particularly around trying to build some of that digital skill base that's going to enable us to go offshore and enable us to do digital well?
Yeah, I think, Phil, there are two things that I think about. So one is upskilling our current workforce, particularly those that have been displaced during COVID. And then the second part that I think about is how do we create the future talent and skills that we need. I find it hard to find talent in New Zealand. So a lot of the partners and consultants and businesses that I need to be flourishing in order to help me scale these ambitions, I can only imagine how hard it is for them. So in terms of developing the future talent, I think that it all starts with education, and I know that obviously that's dealt with centrally within government, but I do think Auckland can be taking a leading position in how we think about this. The government is investing in computational thinking and digital design in schools, but we need to invest in the private sector to really think about how we can support this. So I'm a huge advocate for internships, and I'm also a huge advocate for organisations, both public and private, leaning into investing in these sorts of programs. just last year, we launched with the Singaporean government a project called Skills Ignite, where the Singapore government is literally paying for people either displaced or people that are wanting to move into a sector that requires new skills. They're paying them $1,500 a month allowance to go through digital skills training in conjunction with us. So the Singaporean government came to us and asked us to help them facilitate this training. As I said before, we do have programs in New Zealand that are starting to address this, but it needs significantly more investment, and it needs to be sustained investment over time.
Yeah, thanks for that. Let me turn to you, Anna. In terms of this extraordinary story around aviation and the possibilities, and Nigel, your thinking's not far away from this too. The idea of using Auckland as a petri dish to try to get some of this thinking going. You and I were talking last week about this idea of clean and green. You know, we keep on raving on in New Zealand about how we're clean and green, and maybe we're not quite as clean and green as we thought. But when we think about clean and green, we often think about that as a tourism thing, right? Come and see our pristine lakes. Actually, we can do clean and green very much as a piece of thinking around our digital, around our innovation piece. Can you talk us through that in an aviation perspective?
Yeah, I mean, what we actually need is a mission-driven strategy for New Zealand, in my view, that actually starts to bring forward the how we're actually going to get there. So if we're talking about green tech, we're talking about green aviation. New Zealand's carbon footprint, 14% of that is aviation. So it's a big part of our carbon footprint for the future. We've got to deal with it. There are amazing technologies that are actually being explored around the world. There are 2 companies that would love to come to New Zealand right now. They want to do due diligence. They want to come through the border. That's almost impossible. There are some, obviously some exemptions, but these are really busy people and they don't want to have to wait for 2 weeks to come in. And Australia and Singapore are promising them the world, and you know, we don't even have a timeline for being able to say to them when they could come in, and I think that's a problem. I think that's a real problem. So in terms of that green tech and green aviation, I think we've got this opportunity to actually define what our vision is, attract those companies to New Zealand. These are billion-dollar companies already. They are going to grow high-value jobs, and we can take, in the electric aviation space, we can take any kid who likes an engine and we can turn them into an electric aircraft maintenance engineer, and that's a very, very high value job right now. There's a lot of other jobs that don't just aren't created around the Silicon Valley, you know, PhD students. This is a very deep and very rich industry for New Zealand, for Auckland.
So we were talking last week about the idea that we're really good at starting things in New Zealand. We're not so good at scaling them up and having meaning and heft around them. So what you're really talking about is saying, yes, we need to make some choices, as Peter Gluckman said, then we need to invest in them for the long run. And that's a great time to bring you in, Peter, because, of course, through your work at Auckland University, this very idea of bringing together networks, of bringing together the pulling together of deep tech and then bringing it out to markets is a massive opportunity. Sir Peter talked in his speech about the idea of Auckland University underperforming really when it comes to this outreach to business. Not you personally, you've done an amazing job, but Auckland University, there's a huge opportunity, isn't there, to get Auckland University much more in the lead of some of those opportunities for Auckland. The medtech idea is just one. How do you think we can go about building Auckland University's leadership position given the incredible work that those scientists do?
I mean, I think universities should be driving city economies, and they do around the world. We should be using the universities as the engine for driving innovation. That does require adequate funding of basic research and particularly the translation of that research into real economic opportunity. We need to keep our focus on PhD training as part of that. I think globally we way underinvest in graduate education. I mean, we're currently in the institute that I lead. We have around 100 PhD students, and about 70% of those come from overseas, and that's great. I mean, they often stay, they come here, do their PhDs, and then they go into our startup companies. So it's really valuable strategy for New Zealand to be attracting those students into the country because they stay. But I think we should be doing a much, much better job in terms of getting more people into graduate level education, particularly in my view, in the technical areas that can feed the tech companies that we are creating.
And that's not just a role for the university, is it? That's a role for business, it's a role for Auckland Unlimited and the council,
Yeah.
and it's a role for government in terms of standing behind some of this with funding. So some of the points that the other speakers have been making about being deliberate, about saying, let's stay with this for the long run, let's get those network benefits going, all of those matter, don't they?
They absolutely do. And also in my particular area in medtech, I think the DHBs really matter here too. We should be forming a much better ability to link with innovation ideas that come out of the DHBs, but we could facilitate the economic opportunities that come out of those DHBs.
Nigel, we were talking about this point about the border, and then we've had some very positive comments from the Prime Minister today about the desire that the New Zealand government has to open. I certainly took a lot of heart from those comments this morning. You're facing this frustration, as a number of the panellists are, about getting talent here, about driving innovation, and about also something that's not often talked about people like you need to travel offshore and come back and forth, because at senior levels of business, as I say to people, business is still a contact sport. You still need to shake a hand and create trust and so on. Talk us through some of the opportunities you think we'll have as the border starts to open, as we need to get more energetic, and in particular about some of these ideas around building these petri dishes of innovation, which I thought was really fascinating.
Oh, look, getting offshore is a problem. Well, not getting offshore is not a problem. Getting home is a problem.
That's right.
So we can get in and we can do the handshaking, but getting back home to family and stuff is really, really difficult at the moment. I mean, I would have weekly somebody from the US in particular and parts of Europe ask if they can come and live here, because we did a very good job at addressing COVID in our response. And once again, like Tourism New Zealand said, this is a great place to come to, but by the way, we can't let you do that. So we sort of created this thing, and we can't fully take advantage of it. I mean, that's one of the challenges, and I think that's an opportunity that's fading. So I must admit, Phil, that the first time I heard the comment "Halo New Zealand" was from yourself, and I thought that must have come from Wellington. Look, we've got an opportunity in all of those other things that New Zealand was great about, but we can't lose sight of the fact we're two rocks at the bottom of the world, and it's very difficult to get here. We sit on a lot of people's bucket lists. So I love New Zealand, Lord of the Rings. It's the first thing I get in the United States, Lord of the Rings. And I'd love to come there someday before I die. We don't want to be in that position. We want to attract people here, and we want to retain the students that we train and get them into the types of technologies that we want. So I think from an Auckland perspective, we need to create a very clear framework around those technologies that we want to foster here, and then get aggressive about how we target them. I don't think that's a 12-month think tank, so please don't think I'm putting out there a concept of a bunch of consultants running a 12-month think tank. Just do what everybody else does in the business world and look at the best in the world and just copy them. So there are some amazing cities that are doing incredibly well to attract talent. We should just lift what they're doing and just go, okay, let's just do that. So I think that's a real opportunity. The closer, well, I took heart from the Prime Minister with what she said about vaccine passports. Essentially. So, in the US, everybody that we're working with, and that's probably their target demographic at the moment, has been vaccinated. And they are moving around, starting to move around freely. And again, our sort of place on the world stage with our response is starting to fade. So it's New Zealand is great for all of these reasons. Oh, and by the way, if there's another global pandemic and how that operates, we're a good place to operate as well. But I wouldn't lead with that myself, and I wouldn't recommend that New Zealand leads with that ourselves, because we did have a number of geographic advantages in the way we could deal with this crisis. We're not a multi-border European country that leaks citizens all over the place. So, yeah, look, selfishly, I would have liked to get a vaccine sooner. And I will be one of those groups that the last group talked about that will be gagging to get in there and get this sorted so we can get away and travel.
And you've got an agreement point around that.
I do. I think there's a degree of the timeline as well, because we in business can manage ambiguity. We're not getting a lot of information around what is the ambiguity. We are used to dealing with ambiguity every day, and at the moment there's this need to give us only certainty, and even being able to say we think it's within these timeframes is really helpful to be able to manage the expectations. My CEO and board have asked what's New Zealand's post-COVID strategy. I don't know. So we can't make investment decisions till we get that information.
Caroline, come back to you before I finish. The idea of you've got this particular worldview, which is Australasian, which is a really interesting worldview. And as I say, congratulations on doing that. You and I were talking about the idea of having Australasian research excellence, because there's an opportunity there to use the idea of Auckland as being a leader of potentially an Auckland, Sydney, Melbourne, or Sydney, Brisbane, or whatever it might be, conglomerate of thinking. Can you talk us through some of those ideas? They were really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, Phil, I'm still trying to do this. So when I started looking after the Australian Google business 6 months ago. And 6 months ago, particularly Auckland, we had such a unique advantage that at that point I was actually using Auckland as the bridge to get a research hub in Sydney as well. So looking at the idea of an Australasian research hub, but with Auckland as the bridge to the Pacific and APAC. And it is starting to become harder in terms of the opportunity, because I've got now Singapore as a competitor and even the UK. But yeah, there's so much opportunity for, we could have the cream of the crop down here in terms of computer scientists if we wanted in Auckland. So yeah, I do see there being opportunities, particularly with like things like ag tech or med tech, any of these areas where people are just, even autonomous vehicles, to get a hub down here and then build out across the region.
So what in particular do you need then from local government, central government, to make that a reality? Because we've all talked about the big ideas, and they seem tantalisingly close, don't they? And as Peter and I were talking about, we've talked about these for 10 years, and some of them have been tantalisingly close for that long, and they seem to slip away from us. What are some of the ideas that you've got from your global experience about how we can actually power this up? You know, how do you do that? The Nigel idea of petri dish cities, for example.
Yeah, I mean, petri dish cities come from governments leaning in, making it easy. Like, we've got such a good narrative, but then you get into the actual logistics of doing it, and it's hard. So we need to walk the talk, but also show our willingness to become a petri dish for scale. I'm so passionate about actually Auckland becoming an exporter of so many of these digital ideas, these hubs and companies. I think that's actually where we could have a unique advantage in exporting more of these ideas.
Yeah, great. Well, you've heard, ladies and gentlemen of the audience, some great ideas here, and one of the big themes I've brought out of this is the idea that we now need to think very much post-COVID. We need to not say, well, hey, we were great during COVID. We need to think, well, now what's now our opportunity, given the way the cards have fallen around the world in this post-COVID environment and this next normal that the world is going through. Rather than looking backwards, we need to look forwards. We need to get there with some urgency. We need to have some plans. And I want to pick out some of the things that have come out of this. The idea of having a bit of a COVID strategy for Auckland. You know, what are we going to do now? Peter Gluckman's words were very important there. The idea of can you build heft around aerospace, green aerospace in particular? How can you catalyse this post-COVID economy? How can you, Nigel talked about the Petri dish idea, the idea of working with Auckland Transport, Auckland Council, and the government and the private sector, of course, to start experimenting in Auckland about things around, for example, autonomous and EV infrastructure charging and so on, making sure that there's a legislative framework and a willingness amongst council and AT to actually get that done. Peter, I thought, had a big idea around the creation of a medtech hub in the Grafton Gully. I mean, what an extraordinary thing that would be if we could do that, and the idea of building much more of a leadership for Auckland University, getting some of these network effects going to get deep tech out to you so that you can invest in that I can invest in them as well. Carolyn talked about digital skills and the idea of how we can create Australasian opportunities for ourselves. And as I say, Nigel talked about those petri dish effects and how we might be able to experiment. So there's plenty of ideas and plenty of opportunities and plenty of specific actions that we'll take out of this series of presentations and move into the stage forward as we move past this conference and into our next set of activities with Auckland Unlimited. Can I ask you to thank very much all of these wonderful panellists, and I look forward to seeing you over the cup of tea break.